The Crooked Staircase, another excerpt, starting with chapter 3. Tanuja Shukla was standing in the deep front yard, in the rain and the dark, soaked and chilled and lonely and wildly happy when the assassins arrived. Although, of course, she didn't at once realize they were assassins. 25 and obsessively creative from early childhood, Tanuja had been writing a novelette in which a rain-drenched night provided atmosphere but also served as a metaphor for loneliness and spiritual malaise. After watching the downpour from a window of her second-floor study, she seized the opportunity to immerse herself in the elements, the better to know what her lead character felt during a long journey on foot in a storm. Other writers of literary fiction with elements of fantasy found most research unnecessary, but Tanuja believed that a skeleton of truth needed to provide the structure underlying an author's muscular invention, the fantasy, and that the two must be bound together by tendons of accurate facts and well-observed details. Her twin brother Sanjay, who is 2 minutes younger than Tanuja and considerably more acerbic, had said, "Don't worry. When you die of pneumonia, I'll finish writing your story and the last pages will be the best of it." Tanuja's jeans and black t-shirt were saturated, at first clinging like one of those weighted blankets meant to alleviate anxiety, but then seeming to dissolve so that she felt as if she were unclothed except for her blue sneakers, naked in the storm, vulnerable and alone, exactly how the character in her novelette felt. As she mentally cataloged the physical details of this experience for later use in fiction, she was more content than she had been all day. The house stood at the end of a 2-lane road on 3 acres in the eastern hills of Orange County horse country, and though there were no longer horses on this acreage, white-painted, wire-infilled board fencing encircled the property. 60 or 70 yards west of the house, a gate of the same materials barred entrance to the long driveway. The stormfall drummed the earth and chattered like an infinite number of tumbling dice against the blacktop, and on a nearby 100-year-old live oak, each of the thousands of stiff oval-shaped leaves was a tongue that gave voice to the rain, raising a chorus of whispers that together were like the roar of a distant crowd, all serving to mask the sound of an approaching engine. Because the Shukla place was the last residence before the blacktop dead-ended in a turnaround, the light approaching from the south tweaked Tanuja's curiosity. No visitor was expected. In the murk, the seemingly soundless conveyance appeared to be borne on a tide of mist that roiled off the pavement, headlights chasing before them flocks of shadows that winged across eucalyptus trees on the farther side of the 2-lane road. The vehicle halted at the gate, not facing inward, but athwart the driveway as though to block that exit from the property. When the doors were thrown open, interior lights came on, defying the proportions of a large SUV. The driver doused the headlights, and when the last door closed, the vehicle as good as vanished. Tanuja had stood so long in the deluge that her eyes were fully dark adapted. Because the plank gate was painted white, she could see it even at that distance, less as a gate than as some pale and cryptic symbol, a mysterious hieroglyph floating portentously on the night. She also discerned 3 half-visible figures clambering over that barrier. Outside the gate stood a call box on a post. Visitors were meant to press a button and announce themselves, whereupon the gate could be opened from the house. That these new arrivals eschewed the call box and instead climbed the planking suggested they were not visitors, but intruders bent on mischief, or worse. In her dark clothes with her black hair and maiden of Mumbai complexion, Tanuja would be difficult to spot as long as she avoided the outspill of light from the house. She turned and dashed the massive oak, which gathered rain and channeled it along leafways, from which it drizzled in 100 thick streams. She paused and glanced back and saw 3 big men hurrying up the driveway, their hooded jackets in determined stride, suggesting satanic monks abroad on some infernal task. Hers was not a life of high drama, other than the scenarios that arose in her mind and found expression in her writing. She had not before experienced such hard pounding of the heart as shook her now, as if contained within her breast were both hammer and anvil. She sprinted from the oak and around the south side of the house, staying clear of the light from the windows, onto the back porch. 2 doors. The first opened into the kitchen, the second into the mudroom, but of course both were locked. She fumbled a key from a pocket, dropped it, snatched it from the porch floor, and let herself into the mudroom, where she had left her smartphone before venturing into the storm. Slender and athletic, Tanuja was usually as graceful as a dancer, but now, shedding rainwater, she slipped on the vinyl tile flooring and fell. A door on the left connected the mudroom to the kitchen, and one directly ahead accessed the downstairs hallway. She thrust to her feet. Sodden shoes slipping as if she were a skater on ice, and opened the door and saw Sanjay. He had stepped out of his study and gone into the foyer at the farther end of the hallway, where he'd just now opened the front door. Too late to call out a warning, Tanuja hoped that she had misread the situation, that her overactive imagination had invoked menace where none existed. The first man at the door was known to her. Kind of like the first time I read this book. It was like in Spider-Man 3, when he got taken over, his body got taken over by like that black vinyl-looking revenge poison stuff, but it was like via a computer or something. And it was this book. I bought this book at CVS. I remember it because I was talking to the pharmacist he asked about it, and I was excited, and reading Kuhn's book had come out, and I was explaining it to him, and his response is weird. He said, "That's good?" And I was like, yeah, I thought it was interesting, but then I started going on and on about intensity. I don't know why, it was strange, but anyway, this is the same book, but now the Spider-Man 3 computery part, like brain vinyls, like that part is not here anymore, and instead there are amber vials of like and syringes, and I don't know what happened, but can't be good. It sounds bad. Well, not. It just makes me a little wary. The first man at the door was known to her, Lincoln Crossley, who lived 2 houses south of them, a deputy with the sheriff's department. Link was married to Kendra, who worked as a bailiff at the county courthouse. They had a 16-year-old son, Jeff, and a Labrador retriever named Gustav. They were good people, and for a moment, Tanuja was relieved. Rather than wait for an invitation, however, Crossley and the 2 men behind him crossed the threshold the moment the door opened, crowding Sanjay backward, their boldness disturbing. None of them wore a uniform, and whoever the 2 strangers might be, Crossley's behavior was not protocol for an officer of the law. Tanuja couldn't discern what Link Crossley said or what Sanjay answered, though she heard the deputy speak her name. She eased the mudroom door almost shut, watching through a narrow gap, feeling like a child, a small, uncomprehending girl who by accident stood witness to a mysterious and disquieting adult encounter. Crossley put one arm around Sanjay's shoulders, but in that move, Tanuja read some quality darker than neighborly affection. He was much bigger than Sanjay. One of Crossley's associates drew a pistol, quickly crossed the foyer and ascended the stairs, apparently with no concern that his boots and jacket streamed water on the carpet and the hardwood floor. When the 3rd man closed the front door, stepped out of the foyer, and disappeared into the parlor as though on a search, Tanuja opened a drawer in a mudroom cabinet, retrieved a flashlight, grabbed her phone from a countertop, and fled. She crossed the porch, vaulted the railing, and hurried across the backyard into the wind and rain, not daring yet to switch on the light, her fertile imagination spawning terrors of extreme violence and rape and intolerable humiliation, even as it also crafted desperate scenes in which she might by various means save herself and her brother. This is like the other storyline part. Tanuja Shukla, thrashed by fear but driven by duty, owing her brother no less than everything, hurrying through the dark stable where no horses had been kept for years, hooding the flashlight with her left hand, even though distance and foul weather made it unlikely. Oops. That one of the men in the house, glancing out a window, would glimpse the pale beam. Rain beating on the roof like the booted feet of marching legions, the earthen scent of the hard-packed hoof-imprinted floor, the musty but sweet smell of old straw moldering in the corners of the empty stalls. What had once been the tack room where saddles and bridles and other horse gear had been stored now contained a riding lawnmower, rakes and spades, and gardening tools. A long-handled axe could serve as a weapon, but it wouldn't be enough to help one slender girl drive off or chop down 3 men, even if she had the stomach for such violence, which she didn't. Because the tack room was without windows, she no longer hooded the flashlight beam. She swept it quickly across bags of fertilizer, terracotta pots of all sizes, redwood stakes for tomato plants, cans of spectricide, wasp and hornet killer. From the shelf, she took a container of hornet spray, removed the safety cap. The can was about 10 inches tall, weighed maybe 1.5 pounds. It contained a lot of poison. A cadence wind now brought complex rhythms to the rain as Tanuja returned to the open door of the stable, where she switched off the flashlight and put it on the floor. Hindu by birth, but not by practice, she had not believed in the faith of her mother and father since she'd been 10, which was the year they perished in the crash of a 747 while on a flight from New Delhi to London. Yet now she sent up a prayer to Bhavani, the goddess who is the benign aspect of the fierce Shakti, Bhavani, the giver of life and the great font of mercy. Provide me with strength and allow me to triumph. She plunged into the cold rain, vigorously shaking the can of spectricide as she ran toward the house where Sanjay was perhaps in mortal danger. Sanjay had slid into existence and taken his first breath close behind her, following her from womb to wicked world. Therefore, she must always be his Rakshak, his protector. A crystal bowl like a gypsy's instrument of foretelling that had failed to predict the current threat seemed to float on the translucent milky quartz tabletop, bright with the fullness of ripe roses that shed petals as portentous as blood drops. Sitting at the kitchen table, held there at gunpoint, Sanjay Shukla was both fearful and exhilarated. He was sufficiently self-aware to marvel that in such dire circumstances the thread of delight was woven through his dread. His sister wrote a kind of magic realism, and her new novel, only in stores 3 weeks, had earned all but universal critical acclaim. Sanjay, too, had been declared an author of promise for importing into the literary novel certain qualities of hard-boiled detective stories. Sometimes he worried that he'd not experienced enough of the dangers and roughness of the world to be able to write neo-noir fiction as effectively as he wished. Yes, his parents had died when terrorists blew up an airplane. Yes, his and Tanuja's Mausi, their mother's sister, Aunt Ashima Chatterjee, and her husband Bert, during their guardianship of the Shukla twins, had embezzled 2/3 of the inheritance before their niece and nephew could induce a court to declare them adults at the age of 17. But none of that was the kind of noir ordeal that would have made a good movie with Robert Mitchum. Therefore, Sanjay often wished that he had more gritty experience of threatened violence. Now here he was staring down the barrel of a pistol held by a neighbor who previously seemed a straight arrow as Captain America. A second gunman, a stranger, stood near the door to the mudroom. A third man, whose caterpillar eyebrows nearly met over the bridge of his nose, placed on the table a small cooler from which he produced a packaged hypodermic needle with cannula in a stainless steel box about 9 inches square, 7 or 8 inches deep. He handled the box with cotton gloves, evidently because it was cold enough to take the skin off bare fingers. Sanjay was less alarmed by the pistol than by the syringe. A gun was an easily understood threat, but the needle injected an element of the unknown. It made him think of illness, disease. He wasn't sick. And even if he had been, these men were not here to heal him, which meant they might be here to infect him. That made no sense, but people did a lot of things that made no sense. Sanjay also thought of truth serum, movie scenes involving interrogations, but that didn't compute either, because he didn't have any valuable information to withhold from anyone. He had asked them what they wanted, what they were doing, what this was all about, but they had ignored his questions even though he answered theirs. Maybe they intuited that his answers were not truthful, which is why they responded to his inquiries only with silence. He told them that Tanuja was on a date with her boyfriend and that he didn't know when they would return. He hoped that his sister, who didn't currently have a boyfriend, who had been outside, standing in the rain, engaged in one of her eccentric quests for authentic details to enhance her writing, had seen these men coming, realized their malicious intent, and gone for help. Because conducting an agitated, one-sided conversation would only make him seem desperate and likely to make a break for freedom, Sanjay matched their silence with silence and slumped in the chair, as if sliding into hopelessness. Just a skinny Indian boy with a pair of goalies, no bigger than chickpeas if he had any goalies at all between his legs. The more certain they were that he'd submitted to them, the more likely he might surprise them and escape. The man wearing gloves opened the metal box, from which wafted a pale odorless mist, as if perhaps the contents rested on a bed of dry ice that began to evaporate when exposed to the air. The guns and syringe were frightening, but the shared attitude of the three intruders was even more intimidating. The sense of authority with which they invaded the house and forcibly escorted Sanjay to the kitchen and pressed him into this chair and pushed aside their bowl of roses, slopping water on the quartz. The arrogant silence with which they responded to his protests and questions, their faces without expression, their stares direct and pitiless, as though they regarded him as belonging to a different and inferior species from them. Link Crossley was not himself, lacking his usual humor, and there was something machine-like about all of them. The metal box appeared to contain numerous sleeves of silvery insulation, each perhaps an inch in diameter and 7 inches long. As the glove man removed 3 of these and put them on the table, his frown brought his caterpillar eyebrows together, as if in an act of bristling conjugation. Crossley put his pistol on the counter by the refrigerator and from a jacket pocket produced a length of rubber tubing of the kind that phlebotomists used as a tourniquet to make it easier to find the vein of a patient from whom blood was to be drawn. The unhurried movements of the mute and solemn men, like mimes engaged not in entertainment but in the conveyance of some truth with a terrible consequence. Razor-keen light gleaming off the edges of the stainless steel box as it was pressed shut. A few last feathery emissions from the smoking ice, as ephemeral as the secrets of the deceased issuing from the death-throttled throats of spirits. Moment by moment, the scene became more dreamlike, yet hyper-real in its detail. The gun on the counter seemed to be an opportunity. If Sanjay chose the right moment when the men were distracted, twisted his chair to the left, reared back from the table, bolted up, moved fast, he surely would reach the pistol before the deputy seized it. Though it was important to remember that Link had police training. Crossley also produced a foil packet that might have contained an alcohol-saturated pad to sterilize the skin before pricking it with the needle. Sanjay's attention was drawn again by the 3 silvery tubes. Caterpillar Man peeled open the Velcro closure on one, and into his hand slid a glass ampule containing a cloudy amber fluid. The fragile thread of delight woven through Sanjay's dread had withered away. In the past few minutes, he'd experienced enough threat and violence to inspire his writing for the rest of his career, assuming that he lived long enough to have one. As Caterpillar Man pierced the membrane of the ampule with the needle and drew the amber fluid into the barrel of the syringe, the man standing near the mudroom holstered his gun and approached, perhaps to restrain Sanjay should that be necessary. He yawned as though he must be so experienced in this work that it bored him. For an instant it seemed as if a thick jet of glistering gastric acid erupted from his mouth. But recognizing the smell, Sanjay turned his head to follow the stream of hornet-killing insecticide to its origin. I'm just gonna stop there. I wanted to read that part to remember. Like, I still haven't gotten to the end of this book because it concerned me that the like Spider-Man 3 like vinyl like takeover of like Spider-Man, but in this book it was like the taking over of one's mind, but in a similar kind of way. I can't describe it. Maybe when I read that, it was later on in the book, and I, like, my mind didn't take note of the amber ampule things and vials, and I don't know, but I don't know. I guess to be continued.